prevailed on former President Jacob Zuma. He has begun his 15-month sentence at Escort Correctional Center in KwaZulu-Natal. Zuma is still applying, though, for his sentence to be rescinded. The matter will be heard next Monday at the Constitutional Court. Let's discuss what's next now with Elton Hart. He is with the University of Johannesburg's Law Clinic. Elton, good to see you again. Just weigh in on what happened overnight. A former president, the first former president in South Africa to be taken to prison, albeit on a matter of contempt of court, rather than really questions of allegations of corruption that happened during his tenure and other crimes. What do you make of the significance of the moment?
No, indeed, it's a significant moment and also a watershed moment, because obviously now, yesterday we still went to bed thinking that our democracy is being challenged, our constitution is under fire, and our former president, be it willfully or unwillfully, submitted himself to his sentence that he was supposed to be incarcerated. And obviously, this is now also a situation where the police minister as well as the police commissioner is spared some sort of embarrassment, because obviously by last night, midnight last night, like by 12 this morning, or say 1 minute past 12, if they have not arrested the former president, then the minister as well as the police commissioner was also informed of a court order, because the court order was clear. 5 days, if he doesn't surrender himself, 3 days thereafter you have time to arrest him. So at least I think the actions or non-actions of the parties has somehow worked out well for the democracy, and also to show that there's at least a little bit of respect for the judicial system at this point in time. But I know South Africa is divided on this topic at this point in time.
Elton, I'm having the same issues that I was having with Richard Spoor in as far as the lines are concerned and the connection to you. So the words do break up a little bit from time to time. What is the one issue in our values and the foundations of our Constitution that stands out for you from the processes that happened overnight?
For me, the process that happened overnight is that the foundation is like everybody's equal before the law, all citizens. It doesn't matter what office you hold, you should be treated equally before the law. And if there is a decision taken by a court of law, you have to use your rights within the available statutes in our country and exercise them, and not go and defy what is in place. If you want to challenge something that a court has said or made, use the correct procedures, because nowadays we call ourselves a democracy, so we're not in the apartheid state where we have to now fight because the laws is not treating South African citizens the same. Here the law, the constitution is all for every citizen in this country, and luckily for us as normal South Africans, the former president handed himself over. So to some extent it shows that maybe that people cannot say that he was totally defiant. Yes, he exercised some of his rights using the courts of law, and people will say it's delayed tactics, but obviously it is constitutional rights that he can do it. So obviously for courts also to be just and fair, and also that everyone is equal before the law. That is the principles that was tested over the last couple of days for me, and that stood out.
And Elton, in terms of the path going forward, we saw that letter coming from former President Jacob Zuma's current lawyers, sort of, writing to the Constitutional Court to say, while the issue of the application for a rescission of the judgment and order of the Constitutional Court is pending, will you please consider a stay on the execution of the detention warrant that had also been issued by the same court? What did you make of that 11th hour attempt?
Obviously, that is still that they, and I think the current legal team is trying to play within the parameters of the law, that they can approach the acting Chief Justice, who read out the majority judgment. So obviously, you write it to the acting Chief Justice, who will then discuss it with the other justices of the Constitutional Court to say, okay, we have set time limits. We are the only court that can actually now say, okay, there was nothing wrong with our decision, but maybe our time limits was a little bit too tight for the president to get his house in order so that he can actually submit himself or surrender himself to the nearest correctional facility or police station for that matter. So they're asking that, and that is just what the lawyers, and I think although it came at the 11th hour, it was still the right advice that they gave him to say, listen, yeah, maybe you can approach the court to ask just to extend the time limit and not say by last night, 12 o'clock, 11:59 was your last minute to actually hand yourself over. So I think they just try to play within the book, but there's nothing wrong because obviously we know 8 days in which he had to do what he had to do, or 5 days and 3 days for the minister and the police commissioner. So the advice was good, although maybe at the 11th hour.
You're saying the advice was good, but maybe at the 11th hour. Do you get a sense, as I do, that perhaps the current legal team wishes they could turn back the hands of time and do some of the things differently? I can't shake off this feeling that, you know, having read their affidavit before the High Court in Pietermaritzburg and what they filed in the rescission application, the tone I get there is that if they had the benefit of turning back the hands of time, they certainly would do things very differently. They would address the Constitutional Court at the point at which they were asked to address on the issue of possible sanction if he was to be found guilty of contempt of court. They probably would have been much more involved. That's at least my reading in the applications that happened in March and in December before the Constitutional Court. What do you think? Do you think that they perhaps are feeling that if only we could do things differently?
I believe that obviously as legal practitioners we view things differently. Maybe now, sitting now in hindsight, it's always better to judge what I should have or could have done better in the past. Maybe at that point, because of the limited information available also sometimes to legal practitioners, they make a certain decision. And it's not necessarily that maybe they were advising or it was ill-advised. Maybe it was advised based on the information that they have. Obviously, the current legal team has now all the information at their disposal to look back and say now, okay, that's maybe where we made a mistake or where our predecessors made a mistake. So that places them in a better position to make a judgment call. But I believe so, if they could have turned back the clock and say, okay, we are back before maybe say round and about maybe end of May, 29 May, when he was called to actually give circumstances in mitigation, they would have done so. So that they can say, but we've placed before court, it was not considered, and now we're asking for a rescission, those type of things. But obviously also always the hindsight decision to make a judgment is better than when you're in the boat and actually the boat is being poked full of holes. Then it becomes a difficult situation, and then you have to choose. And sometimes your interpretation of what should happen is different from another legal practitioner's interpretation.
Yeah, and I say that, Elton, partly because in those papers before the court in Pietermaritzburg and in the Constitutional Court, you do have one or two excerpts where the former president suggests that, you know, I was not advised properly on certain matters, and that was my understanding. And now I understand it was an erroneous understanding of the matters. For instance, on the issue of whether or not the Commission of Inquiry would be given time of day before the Constitutional Court around that initial application in December. All right, thank you for your time there. That's Elton Hart, the legal expert at the University of Johannesburg's Law Clinic, weighing in on these matters. And part of the other reason I believe that the current legal team perhaps wishes they could do things differently is that those issues, for instance, around why he shouldn't go to prison, well, actually they're placing a lot of them before the Constitutional Court now in their current application. It's a far cry from the earlier position in April when there was nothing forthcoming, when the court said, address us on what would be appropriate and suitable.